described, it's actually called simple meringue as well. And it's a very simple combination of egg whites and sugar, which all meringues are. I mean, that's basically the foundations of meringue. So you'll see that there's a common theme across all three meringues. Just to give you a little bit of a background about what is actually happening when you're creating a meringue, what happens is that you whisk your egg whites first, and the egg whites, they go from a sort of a gloopy, quite viscous kind of liquid, and they break down and they become thinner. And what's happening there is that you're pulling the protein bonds apart within the egg whites. So you're pulling them apart. But then what happens eventually, the more you whisk, you actually bring those protein bonds back together, and you reform them in a new kind of configuration, which presents itself as basically a foam. And the protein bonds is what holds the moisture and the air in a foam. So the really important thing is that you have strong protein bonds, because if you don't have strong protein bonds, you have a weak foam. Now, what determines strong protein bonds is the freshness of your eggs. So when you go to make meringues, make sure you've got your freshest eggs possible, because fresh eggs are acidic eggs. They've got an acidic nature to them, but it also means the protein is very strong, and it will create strong bonds when you're actually making a foam. So first principle with making meringue is make sure your eggs are really fresh. So I'll start whisking. You want to, oh, we've got a question already, but I just want to explain quickly. When you whisk, start on medium or medium-high speed, not high speed, like many of you have probably made your meringue before. And I'm going to explain that why. But you can ask your question. What would you like to ask?
I don't have chickens in my backyard.
Yes.
To know that my eggs are fresh.
Fresh, yep.
How do I know the eggs are truly fresh?
Yep, great. Great question.
Or at a market, is there a way of working it out?
Yes, there is. Okay, so I'll come back to that in a sec. I just want to show you this. See how it foamed up? It kind of went liquid again, and now it's starting to form a foam. What we want to do is get the egg whites to a soft peak form. And what I mean by soft peaks is when you lift the whisk up out of the foam, the peak stands up, but then it falls gently on itself, and that's what's called soft peaks. If you wanted stiff or firm peaks, the peaks would sit up and it would stay up. So that's the difference between when whisking egg whites, whether you have firm or stiff peaks. So I'm just going to check. The best way to check this is to actually get your whisk into your bowl and lift it up. This is still a little bit too soft. It's actually not standing up before it falls over. So I'm just going to give it a little bit more time. And I haven't forgotten your question, I'm going to come back to it, but it's really crucial that I start adding the sugar at the right time, because you add it at the wrong time and things can happen that you don't want to happen further. Okay. Just check this again. Now this is looking a lot better now, so I'll get my whisk in. Now hopefully you can see this through the camera. Can you see that? That it comes up and then it just tips over on itself. Hold on. Is it doing that for you? Yep, can see that? Okay, great. So let's start adding our sugar. We're going to add caster sugar, not granulated sugar, and we're going to add it a large spoonful at a time. I've got a kind of a slightly small spoon here, so I'm going to add 2 spoonfuls of this at a time. And I've just got that on about a medium-high speed. So that's very happy now. We can leave it and I can answer your question. So the thing about fresh eggs is try and buy from somewhere that has a high turnover, so you know there's lots of traffic and there's lots of turnover, or they put their eggs in a refrigerated section. So you know how some supermarkets just have it on the shelves and some have in the refrigerator? Make sure your preference is to go to the supermarket or the deli or whoever that keeps them in the refrigerator. The reason for this is that eggs lose their freshness 7 times more quickly if kept at room temperature. So you know those beautiful baskets, those egg baskets that we all keep on our counter? Please don't keep your eggs in those, unless you're just going to leave them there for a day and then move them to the fridge. The way you can tell how fresh your eggs are is to get a bowl of water about bowl this size. Fill it about 3/4 full of water and pop your egg, whole egg, raw egg into it. If it's really fresh, it will sit horizontal at the bottom of your bowl. If it's about 2 to 3 weeks old, it'll sit upright. If it's really stale and off, it will actually float. And the reason for this is on the rounded end of your egg, there's an air sac. And the older the egg gets, the more air it draws in through its very porous shell, and the more air it pulls in. And that air kind of acts like a little internal balloon, and it will pull your egg to the surface. So if it sits horizontal, it means that that air sac is very, very small, and you've got really fresh eggs. So that's the best way to judge. Yeah, another question up the back. I will repeat it, so hopefully I'll hear you.
How many egg whites is the best amount to beat up?
Okay, so the question was how many egg whites is the best amount to beat up? You can do anywhere from, I find with a mixing bowl this size, anywhere from 2 to 6 eggs is a good. I've started with 4 today and a cup of sugar, so 220 grams of caster sugar. But it really depends on what you're making, but usually 4 to 6 eggs is a really good combination or an amount to make, say, a pavlova or a decent amount of meringues. However, you need to have your sugar and your egg ratio correct, or, you know, to a certain amount. So if you're using 4 egg whites, I would recommend about a cup of sugar or 1/4 of a cup to every egg. You can go up to 1/3 of a cup for a really crisp meringue if you wanted to though. So today we've got 4 egg whites, we've got 1 cup of sugar, we're going to add 1 teaspoon of vanilla essence, and then we're also going to swirl through 1.5 tablespoons of cocoa powder. Okay, so can you see I'm adding this sugar just a little bit at a time, large spoonful at a time, mixture on medium speed. Yes, you've got a question. It is, yeah, about 6, or it's actually sitting on 7, so it's about a medium high speed. You could put it up to 8 if you wanted to. The reason, and it's a really good question, the reason why, and this is just pure experience, that I've made a lot of meringue in my time, and what I've discovered is if you whisk your egg whites on too high a speed, what will happen is that you will beat too much air into them too quickly. And the air that you're whisking into them will be quite uneven. You'll get quite big air pockets and you'll get tiny little air pockets. If you whisk on medium or medium high speed, what happens is that you still add a lot of air, but it's small bubbles and it's uniformed and it's more even. So by the time you've incorporated all your sugar and whisked your egg whites, by doing that, you end up with this beautiful, thick, luscious meringue mixture that's a bit like shaving cream. If you use a high speed, you'll end up with a really foamy, really uneven type of meringue. And it, not only will it bake unevenly, it will crack once you do bake it. So putting too much air will make your meringue crack. But the other thing that can happen is that it will actually rise a little bit too much and it'll sort of go out of shape. So that can happen when you're incorporating too much air. Yes, we've got a question over here. Oh, sorry. Oh, that was worse for me, I can tell you, than it was for you. So are you using the eggs at room temperature or chilled? So my eggs, I like to use them at room temperature. When eggs are chilled, the protein bonds are firmer, so it's a nice balance. If you've got really fresh eggs, use them at room temperature. However, if you've got slightly stale eggs, use them chilled, and you'll get that beautiful balance between the strength of the protein bonds. It's a great question. What size? I use 59 to 60 gram eggs, which is a 700 gram carton. Yeah, I'm just going to move it away from there because it was it made me a bit dizzy. I'm going to go back and add some more sugar. So this, whisking in this sugar for a simple French meringue should take about 8 minutes, kind of give and take a couple of minutes. Okay, so we're using caster sugar because it dissolves more readily in your meringue. If you were to use granulated sugar, there'd be likelihood, or something like a demerara sugar or a like a coffee crystal or something like that, you would end up with crystals of sugar in your meringue that is not dissolved before it goes into the oven. And what happens with those whole crystals, because what happens to sugar when it's heated, it melts and it becomes a liquid. And so has anyone had with their meringues weeping or beading with their meringues? Quite often that is caused by not making sure that the sugar is completely dissolved before you put it in the oven. So using caster sugar, you can use brown sugar as well. You'll get a chewier meringue with brown sugar because it's more moist than caster sugar. But caster sugar is a really good sugar to use. Now I had a question over here, yes? Egg whites from the freezer section of or the fridge, so just egg whites. So it's, I'm not a big fan of them. You can use them, but I kind of go, why not buy the eggs and separate them and use the egg yolks for something else, and then you've got something. And they tend to be quite expensive. And the other thing with the egg whites, some of them do, but some of them don't, but most of them do have additives added to them to preserve the egg whites. And that can muck with your meringue making as well. So I prefer just go fresh. Go fresh. I mean, there is nothing better than using really wholesome, pure, natural ingredients. And we don't need to, don't worry, you're going to get me on one of my bandwagons. We don't need to package everything up, you know, and we don't need to make it, well, what is supposedly convenient, because quite often it's actually not that convenient. It's just that you're adding all this packaging to it as well. Okay, we are almost there with our meringue. I've got just two more sort of additions of sugar to go with this. But what you'll notice is that the volume has really increased. The sugar is dissolving, but I'll show you a test of how to check whether the sugar is dissolved or not. And then we'll go from there. So this is a simple French meringue that we're making at the moment. Yes? So you can put... Oh, great question. The question was, can you add less sugar? So in this world of everyone's like sugar kind of a bit shy, meringue unfortunately is one of those, well, probably fortunately too, it's one of those things you can't add less sugar. And do you know why? Because essentially what meringue is that you have egg whites that are made up of water and protein and sugar. And you bring the two together, you make a foam out of them, then you put them in the oven and you dry them out. So what you get rid of is the moisture, and what you're left with is a sugar. It's the little tiny air bubbles of air, and they're sugar encrusted. So the less sugar you put into your meringue, the less crisp they will be. So I could actually make a meringue with 4 egg whites and half a cup of sugar, not a cup of sugar. But what I'll end up with is a really soft meringue that won't dry out completely. And that's why we'll talk a little bit in a minute about Swiss meringue and Italian meringue, but they tend to be a higher concentration of sugar than a French meringue. And therefore, when you bake them, they become more crisp. So you can add less sugar, but don't expect to have a really beautiful crisp meringue. And the other thing is they'll be quite sloppy to shape on your tray, because the more sugar you incorporate, the more stable that foam becomes, because sugar actually stabilizes egg whites. And that's what's so beautiful about it. Sorry, what was that?
The rolled pavlova?
The rolled pavlova. Yes, so the rolled pavlova, that's exactly right. So, does anyone know what we're meaning? Is that you got a Swiss roll which is made of a pavlova mixture. That's where you can add less sugar, and you actually can add a lot less sugar. It's about 1/4 of what you use here. So to test if all this sugar is dissolved, you just have to take a little bit on your fingertip and rub it between your fingers. Okay, I can still feel a little bit of sugar. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scrape the sides of the bowl down to make sure that any sugar that's caught around the bowl is incorporated. And I'm just going to give that about another minute and it should be fine. So we've got another question up here. What's your question? Sorry, we don't have a mic actually, so yes you can. Great question. Yes, you can over whisk your egg white. So that's why it's really important, once you've incorporated that last bit of sugar, give it a whisk for about a minute or two, then check it. Once, and then if it, as I have, I checked it, there was still a little bit left, I'll put it on for another minute. Then I'll check it again, and I can pretty much say that sugar will be gone, and then I stop whisking. Because what happens, because remember we've got protein bonds, we've pulled them apart, we're pushing them back together, reconforming or forming a new foam. And the more you whisk, the tighter those protein bonds become. If you over whisk, you can force them too tightly together. And once you bake it, it will let out that excess moisture, and it'll let out more moisture than what can evaporate. So what happens there is you get that weeping around your pavlova or your meringue. So you get that messy bit around the bottom of it, which is not very nice. So yes, you can over whisk. It's pretty hard to do, and the more sugar you add to meringue mixture, the harder it is to over whisk. And that's mainly because, remember, sugar stabilizes a foam. But yeah, great question. Okay, I can see this is actually even a better texture now that I've just whisked that a little bit longer, because the other thing is, if you don't whisk long enough, that sugar is not going to dissolve. You're going to go into the oven with sugar crystals, they're going to melt, you're going to get weeping, or what's called beading, where the sugar syrup leaks out and it forms little beads of sugar encrusted around the outside.